My name is David Berg, and I am moderating today. I'm a business intelligence developer with SMPH, and our speaker today is Alan McKellar. We have some time at the end for Q&A and also throughout this presentation. If you're joining us virtually, please place your questions in the chat and I'll read them to our presenter. If you are joining us in person, please line up to use the microphone in the aisle. So now I'd like to introduce you today to our presenter, Alan McKellar. Alan joins us from Colorado. He has worked in product development for over 24 years in a variety of domains, primarily as a project manager. Alan believes that the key to product development is the people who hold the passion to create products that serve others. So without further ado, let's hear it for Alan.
We'll just make an adjustment. So good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you today. By a show of hands, how many people have completed the Laura Challenge today? You've met 4 new contacts. All right. How about 3 new contacts? 2? 2? All right. Good, good. So we're getting out there, we're meeting new colleagues and learning something new and sharing ourselves and our experience with others. So that's really great. And that's what I'm hoping to do this afternoon with you. As a professional, when I think through how to manage programs, I was overwhelmed at times. There's a lot of things to consider. With Laura's discussion this morning, we heard about the 4 I's as one tool. We heard about the 3 lenses as another tool. I sat in on the governance panel and all the governance models they ought to be concerned about. Article 10, whatever that is. Organized labor. We have to deal with different committees. And from a project perspective, there's different life cycles to consider and different constraints. So I was speaking with a good colleague of mine named Sarah Koyman about how her experience and my experience might be distilled to a handful of principles. And we created what we called the GRIP framework to help us stay on track. And so today what we're going to talk about is this GRIP framework, which I hope will provide you some utility today. Then I'm going to reinforce that by sharing 3 examples, and we'll take questions after each example. So it's very much a dialogue. I know it's after lunch, but I'm going to ask you to share. And then after that, I'll summarize the GRIP framework once again, and then open the floor up for any other questions we might have. So does that sound good? All right, you're gonna tell right away I'm a software guy. Do I have a finger, 5 fingers? I know this is a thumb. Fist of 5. People I can proceed? Yes? All right. So before we dive in though, the first thing is we've got to agree to some terms, I think. So the first one is on leadership, because it's a loaded term. We use it a lot. So David had asked folks that are attending virtually to provide some examples of leaders. So I'm going to turn the floor back over to David and ask him to share. What are some of the names that people are sharing, David? No names. All right. Well, how about inside the room? Just shout it out if you feel it. Who is a leader to you? Anybody? Barack Obama. Okay, another one. Very much agree, by the way. Louis Brooks. Okay, very cool. Different domain entirely. Anytime. Martin Luther King. Yes, absolutely. All right, so in those 3 examples, I would suggest to you that, and they all come from different domains, what they do is they bring out the best in people. So for our session this afternoon, I'm going to say that leaders bring out the best, and why that's really helpful to us, as we heard this morning with all the initiatives that are going on campus. We are all asked and expected to be leaders. And what is our place in that? Well, with this definition, all of us have a role to play because we can make our colleagues better. We can make stakeholders better. I'm going to use the metaphor of a concert conductor deliberately because we're going to unify a number of different performers that are coming together. Those performers in turn are listening to each other. If you've ever played in a symphony or a band, you understand this well. I don't, because my children do, so they tell me these things, but we have to listen to other musicians in that organization. We have to look at the conductor who is trying to bring us together and unify us as one voice. Notice I'm not using any other words like coercion or that we want to make everybody look the same. We're trying to unify because that is what the university is trying to accomplish with its vision. All right, so while I'm talking about influence, can somebody shout out what they think influence is? So providing a resonating response based on a number of factors like context. So very good.
I'll take leading without a title that says leader.
Sure, absolutely. Leading without a title. What else? So I would submit to you, well, before we dive in, what is it not? Let's try it from that perspective. What is not influence? Mandating, forcing. So again, that coercion word that I used earlier, right? So influence is positive, it's transparent. And part of the excitement I feel from being here as an outsider to the university is that it's readily apparent to me that you share that as a community. It seems to be a value of yours. It is part of your culture. That is the informal way you've agreed that work gets done. It may not be explicitly written down, but you've decided to develop a space that's nurturing and mutually supportive. And that's really cool. All right, and then finally, what is a framework? I'm going to present GRIP to you. What is a framework? I'm going to give you your $20 right after this. So thank you for that. Yeah. So no, very good point. A framework is a model we can have in our mind to guide us as we're doing the work. And I don't know about you, but when I'm dealing with stakeholders on the fly, I'm not necessarily my best when I'm doing that, taking questions and fielding them. And so going back to the fundamentals is a principle of mine. It's always helped me. So with that in mind, again, leadership is about bringing out the best in our people. Influence is about being positive and transparent. And finally, we're going to have a model that will help guide us. We're going to jump right into grip. So the G, very often what we find is that we're not aligned on goals. And you'll note from Laura's discussion this morning, what was the basis of everything she talked about? Getting to the culture and the alignment. That was her first step. Next, rhythm and tempo of activities. So don't underestimate the power of meetings as much as we probably all dread them. Having meetings on a regular basis, having communications come on a regular basis from multiple channels, email, text messaging, Slack if you use it, whatever that is, but reinforcing what that message is. Do not underestimate the power of providing a structure of information that people can latch onto. And by providing multiple channels, they can get the information in a way that they can digest. I stands for intentional communication. So being really specific about what you want to accomplish with each vehicle. So if you're having a meeting, for example, is it to make a decision? Is it to share our status? Is it to get approval? But be really clear with yourself and your stakeholders why you're there. And then finally, P, once you have the rhythm in place and you're really intentional on what you want to communicate, now you've created the evil P word, process. But the good thing about process is you can improve it. You can measure it, and then you communicate that progress to others, and you get more buy-in. Does that make sense? Goals, the rhythm of the activities, the intentional communication, and finally, the process. All right, so I'm going to step you through the first example. It is a current example based on artificial intelligence. I was at a startup at 2020. I was their engineering senior director. I was their first professional manager hire. Rapidly growing business. I helped them secure their Series B, which was 25 million in funding, and they did not know what to do, which is typical of startups. And one of the things, and I come again from an enterprise background, 24 years, and I really get nervous when I see people doing things and there's no charter. Makes me very anxious. And we had an engineer playing data engineering person, and I asked him, well, where are the requirements? Why are we doing that? And he's like, I don't know, I'm just playing. And that very much concerned me, right? So one of the reasons was from support, but as I talked to other stakeholders, they didn't know what he was doing, and they didn't know if there was any value to the organization. And so he had gone off and built something. We were in Google Cloud, so he used Apache Airflow, Beam, and BigQuery because we're in Google Cloud. All those tools are natural to that, right? So from an architectural and IT viewpoint, made a lot of sense. But for the stakeholders, they didn't understand the value that would bring. So my first thing was to align the organization around the goal, because I want them all to share in the same journey with R&D. And so the first thing was working with marketing and sales and product, figuring out that we wanted to understand why customers were using our platform to get automotive refinance. So that's what Caribou Financial does. Once we agreed to that goal, then I had to figure out the rhythm. Here, I did not have a lot of latitude, because as a startup, every day brought a new set of requirements from the CEO and the CTO, literally. I would get an email or a Slack message, Alan, we want this. Alan, we're going to do that. It was maddening to me, right? But what I could do is recognize that and latch into it, which allowed me to work with other stakeholders in the company, including marketing, which sends out the message to the clients and lets them know what our value proposition is, product that tells us what to build, engineering, which was my group, and what we were going to build, identify key metrics, which nobody had measured it, so nobody knew if we were successful or not. And so after my discussions, and I like to keep things simple, I said, how about uptime and refresh rate for the data? So the refresh rate for the data set was 6 hours every night, and uptime was about nil, right? Because every morning I walked in, I pull up a page, and the operations VP would poke me in the eye and say, hey, Alan, this website's down, right? So 2 simple metrics. And then I set up quarterly meetings with everybody in the business to review progress and provide data. Apparently my timing's off, sorry. So, and provide data to the organization. And what this allowed us to do was to share progress that was meaningful to the stakeholders. And then for me as a program manager to do what I like to do, perform a risk assessment. And I'll explain why that's important in a moment. Okay, so again, very confused context, trying to get my hands around this, just joined the company, trying to provide direction to an organization that consisted of a part-time individual and making sure that we had buy-in from the organization. All right, so the results. We improved performance in a number of ways that I could share it with the organization, they would share, and I actually used a very similar slide. You'll notice from the previous slide, there's a big chunk missing out of this diagram of what the pipeline looks like. So in the risk assessment, what we had found is that Apache Airflow and Beam actually perform many of the same data pipeline building tasks. They were redundant, and that conflict caused the data refresh rate to be 6 hours. By removing one of those elements, and we chose Beam, I reduced it from 6 hours to under 10 minutes. And that also meant that we were saving, because I wasn't paying for Beam anymore, $120,000 a year. So really hard numbers I could share with the organization and convince people we should keep on doing this thing, right? It also helped us because we were paying Google a gob of money for top of funnel search to find us. So there's this phenomenon known as SEO, search engine optimization. It's beyond me because I'm not a marketer, but we were able to reduce that down to a third of our total spend prior to that because we were cleaning up our act. More importantly, it allowed us to get 2 big partners. Now, I told you in the beginning, we raised 25 million. This is the only startup I've been a part of. I've been a part of 3 that was reached unicorn status. And there's a specific definition for that, 1 billion in revenue in under 5 years. Caribou did a really nice job. And in great measure, it was because we got 2 partners that people know because they don't know who Caribou Financial is. But they knew who SoFi was, and it helped the business. And from my perspective, it allowed me to make further investment in data engineering, actually create a department and help out with that. Okay, so based on that example of a startup trying to clean up its data pipeline to take advantage of artificial intelligence, what observations or questions do you have? Yeah.
Could you talk about rhythm and tempo a little bit more? How did you manage rhythm and tempo? You said they were moving very fast. I think obviously one thing that has to happen when you're getting alignment and making sure that you're all moving the right direction is to slow down a bit. How did you manage that aspect of it?
That's a great question. So how do you manage tempo, especially when you have this desire to kind of get things in order and slow down? And in many cases, going slow to go fast actually works. In this context, and you'll see other examples, the next 2 where I did slow things down. In this environment, I was not allowed. That was not a degree of freedom that the CEO and the CTO gave me. So I had to adapt, and I had to find other degrees of freedom that I could exploit to take advantage of it. So in this case, because they didn't have initially defined anything for data engineering specific. So what I did is I reframed the problem, frankly, and said, data engineering, data science is a separate thing. And nobody challenged me on it, oddly enough. And so I said, okay, and now data engineering will provide those of you that are more precise, fortnightly updates instead of bi-weekly. The sprints there were actually a week long, and it was actually happening way too fast based on my experience. But again, it was outside my control. So I said every 2 weeks, I'll provide a formal update to all the important partners. And then I brought in, as I mentioned, product, sales, marketing, and had them as part of the discussion because now they can't as easily be deniers of the initiative because they're in the meetings. There's this genius to it, right? If I've involved you in the committee, you can't easily poke holes in it if I've done the engagement properly, right? So I couldn't affect the rhythm as much as I wanted to overall, but the way I provided updates every 2 weeks, that I updated the Confluence page consistently, and that's the key, is being consistent and doing it over and over again so stakeholders know what to expect, what the content of that deliverable is, where they can find it. You want to make it really easy. And when I would do skip levels with colleagues and peers, I would pressure test this, and I would tell them being very upfront, I really want to make sure I'm delivering value to you. So Eliza in marketing, do you know where you go to figure out what we're doing with data pipelines? And if she told me no, I shook my head and said, that's a failure on me. And I would work and update that for her and try to find ways to make it really easy to access information. So great question. Does that help? Okay.
We have a question from the chat from Robert Merrill. How did you help that engineer change their thinking?
How did I help that engineer change their thinking? So some really hard conversations, because in that case, that individual wasn't delivering on everything they had promised. And so my school of thought is under promise, over deliver. And he was operating from a context of over promise and under deliver. And that doesn't work for me. So speaking with them very openly and sharing the value set and then being explicit, what is the culture we want to establish in engineering? Because from my perspective, there's all these downstream partners I've got to support. So product tells me as an engineer what to work on and why we're doing it. Marketing puts out to clients what we're building and why they should buy it. I have to make sure all those other stakeholders are made happy. Very similar to what we have to do here in the university. We have a myriad of stakeholders that we have to make happy, right? And so it was really going back and forth and listening to him and understanding where he was coming from, and then saying, we're growing. And when I joined, there were 7 engineers, and then I hired another 70 in the next 9 months. And so every time I had a new hire, I told them, this is what's important to engineering, and just reinforcing that message. And, he did accept it, and he got excited about it. Because once you paint that vision, one of the great things about all 3 examples that were shared, Martin Luther King, the others, is that they paint a vision for us to latch into. We get excited. We go, wow, we can do that? Absolutely. And then they give us space to figure out all the details, how we're going to do it. Those leaders don't prescribe everything. They provide that vision, we latch in, and then we commit our brains and our own creativity to contribute how we're going to get there. Did that help them?
There's a follow-up question. What moved that engineer to overpromise?
Well, we rewarded it, frankly, before I got there, just to be open. And to be fair, prior to Series B, it's about making lots of promises, and some of them stick, right? So it depends on what the investors want to do. But I was brought in, and I asked this question very specifically of the founders. This is how I operate. Is that okay? And they said that they wanted it. And in subsequent discussions, I would reinforce. Now, remember, you brought me in to provide rigor and discipline in engineering, and this is how I'm approaching it. What do you think? And I would pressure test that I was meeting their expectations. And sometimes I had to make adjustments, to be frank. All right, very good. So let's go on to the next example, which is a much bigger example and a little bit different. I was at CA Technologies. I had just been promoted. I was dealing with their 3rd largest global customer. They purchased the entire portfolio, over 40 products from CA. The deal was a multi-year deal valued at $146 million. 2 other people had volunteered. I had volunteered to do this job, and my general manager said, no, you're too young and too inexperienced. And after 6 months of pain, John came back to me and said, hey, remember how you volunteered? And I'm like, no, I'm not doing it. I volunteered 6 months ago, guy, and you didn't want my help then. It's a mess now. It's even worse. And he's like, you owe me. I promoted you, and we went back and forth. And then he said, shut up, just go do it. All right. So I did it. Really difficult situation. As you can see here, just talking about defects alone, over 700 logged in Jira. 700 defects on a network management system called NIMSoft, which was actually really dumb. It was a stupid system. All it told you, the network object, whether it was a router, a switch, database, a web app, was up or down. That's all it did. That's it. This is in 2016. And they were holding up the deal. We were only $2 million of this $146 million deal. They were holding up the entire deal because of my product. And so there was tremendous pressure. The CEO, who was not a nice guy, by the way, would call me in the middle of the night. I would tell him, I would take the call and be like, okay, well, let's talk about it in the morning. Right, Mike? Well, not going to talk about it right now. So really, really difficult. There was no program management office in my company or at the bank. The bank had 14 lines of business. Basically, each country they operated in, they had a line of business. And nobody was bringing together all those requirements, sorting them, and prioritizing them. So it was a nightmare. And most importantly, because of that lack of coordination and communication, we didn't know what to do. Nobody knew what to do. What would you do? 700 defects, hundreds of requirements. How would you even begin to tackle this? Oh, by the way, nobody had a due date, but they just said it was due yesterday. Ever had one of those? Yeah. So I'll tell you what I did. I flew to Paris unannounced. Well, I actually flew into London first, sat with customer success and listened to them and said, hey, what's going on? And they're like, I don't know, but we have daily meetings and the customer's really mad. Great. Mad about what? They're just mad. Your product sucks. Thank you. So then I go to Paris and I sit down with sales who owns the relationship with the customer, right? So I sit down with the account manager and I ask them, what's going on? Same exact set of answers. But they were having their own daily meetings with the client. So, my spidey sense is tingling, red flags popping up everywhere. I really don't actually know what to do. So I went on site unannounced. I got a security badge out of the bank. I'm not sure how, because BNP Paribas is actually a very large multinational bank, but I convinced the security manager to give me a badge, and I started walking around on campus, which is on the east side of Montreal, and I started talking to people, and I actually don't know French at all. So I met with 9 program managers, and I asked 3 questions. My predecessors had done something similar. They had done it remote, and they would ask, prioritize the list of hundreds of things. Prioritize that list. And then they would argue with the client because you can't prioritize hundreds of things. So when I sat down with the client, I asked 4 questions. The first was, tell me what you like about NIMSoft. Because I want them in a positive state. I want them to think good thoughts. There's a reason why in software, when we start retrospectives, we say what went well. We want to be in the open state. We want to be positive. We want to share and nurture information. I let them do that, recognizing there's some value to the NIMSoft product. And then I go into for the hard stuff, tell me about everything that's wrong. And they would vent about that. The third question was, tell me about the one thing, if I gave it to you, you would continue and commit to me, you would deploy. What is that one thing? And then the last question was, who else should I talk to at the bank? And with that, I got a couple really important insights. The first was, help me set a goal. Now I know what I want to aim for and what the intent was. It's always important to understand intent because as we've heard earlier today, we want to assume positive intent from our stakeholders. Sometimes it's not easy because they don't make it easy on us. So I've got to find a way to kind of channel that energy, make sure we stay focused. And it was not to give us $146 million. It was to get a baseline of information so they could buy more infrastructure. That was why they were doing it. All program managers were very afraid of how to explain to other executives at the bank higher above them they needed money. Nobody could explain that story. And an NMS naturally tells you utility rates of different devices and how much storage you've got and how much traffic you're putting on your network, et cetera. And they needed that baseline to justify it. So now we've got a target. I can align all my stakeholders inside my company because a lot of them weren't reporting into me. And that's one of the tricks. When you're dealing and you're working with collaboration, you got to get people on board. So finding the right information to do that. Here, you'll notice I mentioned earlier, daily meetings of all these different groups, a lot of noise. I just slowed it way down because I had the ability to do that. I actually told customer success, except no more phone calls, and here's my email. I don't care. Have the customer come to me. I'll tell them no. And that's another thing. Power of no. I don't know if you can get to do that at the university quite as much, but no skills are important, I find, not overcommitting and setting expectations with different stakeholders. And we would give them the drop every 2 weeks after we tested. Before this, and it's a symptom to me that things aren't going well, the customer would tell us what to do. That's never good. When the customer's reaching in and telling you how to run your shop, you have failed as a project manager, right? And you want to work to get control of that. And then in terms of the intentional communication, before it was lacking. We didn't have any good data, no good information, but providing updates weekly to keep the executives happy was important, and to provide more detailed technical information for the folks doing the work. So the right level of information for that intended stakeholder was key. And then sticking with the process. Once we started to demonstrate some quick wins and some momentum, executives at the bank, believe it or not, were telling me, we want more meetings. And I actually had to say no. Very nicely, by the way, but I would say, I don't recommend it. Tell me more about why you want to see that. And they said, well, you're making progress. We want to drive it harder. And I'm like, well, if what I'm doing works, let me continue to do that. And they let me go ahead and move forward based on the results. All right, so we won a $152 million deal. The reason why it's bigger than the first number I shared with you is that I developed a 6-month recovery plan with 8 milestones based on the discussions with the 9 program managers, and we delivered it in 4 months. And so by reframing the document or the expectation and using a new document to demonstrate success, I could, for that stakeholder group, the executives, I could say, here are the major milestones, and it's not in this deck, but for the technical experts, we had something that was decomposed for more technical work for the teams that actually had to deliver, right? So for various stakeholders, we had the right level of information to help them be successful. And then I got to go to Museum d'Orsay, which I never even knew existed, and see Van Gogh's self-portrait. So I got cultured along the way. It was pretty cool. Okay, so based on the BNP Paribas example, are there any questions or observations?
Just an observation, it sounds like the conversation's really shifted from being information related to being results driven. So that's what gave you space and autonomy to say no to more meetings, was because they began to trust in the results versus needing information about everything.
Yeah, that's a great point. For me, there's a reason why I'm not in marketing. I got a C when I went back for my MBA. So it's not my superpower. I believe get the results and you can speak from the data, and it's much more compelling. There are individuals like CEOs and startups that convince people that you should invest in the company. It's not my gift, but I can go back to the data and provide line of sight for various stakeholders, whether it's an engineer internally or a client or a colleague, and show the results. And I think it's all rooted from the results. And they can debate me about the validity of those results. But I find most of the time when I present the data, and it can be on anything, so finding the thing to measure that's meaningful and sharing it is actually a lot of the work that I put in the thought process of what do I work on that's compelling? And oh, by the way, it changes, I find often. So as I learn more from my stakeholders, I learn more about what our capability is as an organization. I will adapt and incorporate new metrics, by the way, by removing others. So I think a lot of executives, what they'll do is they'll just pile on, but it becomes really difficult to manage all of that. So if you're going to add more work in the basket, take some out too.
Hi, Colin from SMPH. So I have an observation, and I guess that can dovetail into a question. What resonated for me was the last question you asked the bank, which was, who else should I talk to? And for me, that really helps leading a change, especially when you don't know who the stakeholders are and what their actual concerns are, or you want to actually build a relationship with those folks, and it can really help to understand all the players involved. But I guess the question would be then, did you find that helpful, or what was the most helpful thing about that question? Where did that lead you?
Wow. It was very helpful to me because no single person I had spoken to up until that point in the early part of what I would call discovery, because again, my background's in network management as well. So Disco, I couldn't figure out, oh my gosh, what's really important? Who is the major player here? Nobody was. So asking that question allowed me to uncover the next individual. Between those 9 program managers, there was some overlap. So fortunately, that was constrained. And then again, reflecting my background as a project manager, because I am a PMP, so I've been professionally certified for over 20 years, I was looking to limit scope. That's all I was doing. And interestingly to me, my general manager, who was a great mentor to me, when I came back from Paris on that trip and I outlined the 8 milestones and I gave him my draft email that I wanted him to send as if it was from him to the CEO, he said, "This is brilliant. You have no major changes in algorithms. You don't add any new features. You're going to fix a bunch of stuff that's, with the exception of one item, which was database performance, which is always difficult to nail down, performance in general, right? But with the exception of performance, the other 7 things were tied to very label changes in the UI, for example, really easy things." And I had never thought of it that way. I was just trying to limit them, literally, give me one thing. I'm going to go back to Colorado and try and convince people to work on it. That's what I'm going to do, right? But it was a whole new perspective. I didn't add any new calculations to the product, no new UI, but uncovering that and finding out who the other stakeholders were important. Because what I then did was I sent out an email to the 9 program managers and said, "This is what I found out." And nobody challenged me on it. I just said, "These are the things I found out from you. These are the 8 major deliverables you need to see. Do you agree?" And a few people said, "Yeah, oui, depending on what region of France they were from. And a few people did not respond at all. And so when I officially was called out to the bank 2 weeks later and I showed up in my monkey suit, the VP said, "Well, we do not believe you, Elaine. This is not the truth, not possible." And I went, hit up your program managers. The program managers regurgitated what I fed them. And the VPs were like, "Wow, how did you know?" Because they didn't even know, but they didn't have the time to do what I did. So great question. Yes.
So this is a great narrative, and you have this the go to Paris moment. Can you talk just a little more about like how you're like, I'm going to do this, and we have that with a variety of things. We're just like, you know what, whatever we're doing is like definitely not working. Did you have inspiration for that, or just I don't know, let's try it.
Yeah, great question. So a number of factors had pulled together for me that helped me out. One was I was humbled that a number of people that worked with me in HP Labs followed me to CA to work on NIMSoft. So there was a strong group of leaders that I knew very well. They understood what was important to me. We shared the same value set, and I could cut them loose. So I didn't have to worry about operations. The other colleagues of mine that tried to tackle this problem, they didn't have that. They didn't have somebody that they could trust and completely rely and give it up to and delegate to. So I literally walked away for 6 months is what I did. So there was that. The second part was that throughout my career in HP Labs, we could travel when there was a crisis. So my very first project in the labs was to deliver a new telco system. It was a partnership with Intel. Nobody agreed to the milestones. They said 7.5 million's come from Intel, 7.5 million from HP, and nobody knew how that was possible. In other words, the mechanism. How does Alan's ATCA project get money out of Intel? I had to define that as a program manager. And so instead of waiting until there was a crisis and then traveling, because in that we actually got to a point where fighting through all this inertia and bureaucracy got to 9 months later, we're going to ship product, worldwide shipment out of Singapore. We had stockpiled $2 million of fasteners. That's a fancy word in hardware land for screws. $2 million in screws for a specific telco blade. And the facility said, we can't proceed with build because it fails the clamshell test. I went, what's a clamshell? right? And then I literally grabbed Tim Fry and we're like, you got a passport? Who's got a passport on the team? There are only 9 of us. I was like, who's got a passport? We're going to Singapore. And I went to our admin and I asked Debbie, who's a friend to this day, I need 2 tickets to Singapore now. Business class, Tim and I are going to go. And we flew down. And it's so expensive to recover. The amount of energy, right, you've got to do. So dealing with those up front, building the relationships as Laura had suggested to us early, and doing things often with them so that when the moment comes, we're not trying to build a relationship and solving a problem at the same time. We've already established the relationship. They know we're good actors. They know we want what's best for the organization, so they help us. So I would say those are the 2 major things that came together, the experience and having a really good team with me.
All right, last question for this example.
You started to answer my question in the last question, which is as your examples progress from small startup to bigger startup and now this larger corporation, there's 2 ways to answer this question. What did you have to delegate out because it was then too big, or vice versa? What is it that in all those contexts you have to keep as the leader, as you can't delegate?
Well, I find, so I'll say the first thing. So in Alan's management philosophy, control is an illusion. So I've come to accept that. Earlier in my career, I was talking to an individual, Paul, this morning about, why do you want to become a manager, Paul? And he said, well, I think I'll have more influence and control. And I chuckled quietly inside, because when you become a manager, you give up control. And to the extent you can accept that and delegate, I think it's more powerful. I also feel in terms of my management philosophy, developing others is important, and I want them to be successful, and I want them to feel empowered. And I had some really bad experiences in the Navy where people micromanaged me, and I did not do well under that. It's one of my personal failings, right? But recognizing that, I would look for individuals that were respectful but had a contrarian view, wanted to grow, and wanted to take the initiative. And as one chief product officer I worked for in Boulder would say to me often, don't be so certain about what you want and take something better. Often our people come up with much better ideas. So, I find that there, in fact, very few things we as leaders need to do directly. But we should recognize what those are. Budget development, right? And approval, promotions are pretty key, right? Because promotions indicate what we value in the organization. What are we going to recognize? Be concerned about what people are going to interpret. I remember in HP Labs, it was the Nonstop server lab, which runs all the financial markets in the world. So if you've heard of Nonstop, that comes from HP Labs. I was a part of that. By itself, that was at the time, a $6 billion lab. They would spend more in prototypes in a month, 20 million, than my $17 million program did all year. And we promoted 5 people the first year I was there. The first 4, everybody got. They were all double E's because it was a hardware lab, so electrical engineers. And then they promoted the IT tools guy. And so my director, who actually developed the hardware lifecycle for HP Labs, Howell Felsenthal, came to me because I didn't recognize it at the time, but apparently I speak truth to power. And Hal asked me, why is everybody upset about Nick getting promoted? Well, he's the IT guy. Nobody gets that. We're a hardware lab. You should have promoted in double E. And he's like, do you recognize that he pulled together all the requirements from Fort Collins, Houston, and what was Compaq, because we had just gone through an acquisition, and Palo Alto, and convinced them to use our tools. So none of our double E's had to change for schematic capture and layout. And I said, no. And I bet you none of the 300 of us in the lab don't know that either, Hal. And so he changed his communication to indicate to people this was what was important, right? So my point to you is, especially as leaders, recognize what you don't do and what you don't say might be interpreted by others in a very different way that was not intended. And so getting out there and being consistent with your message and thinking through and getting feedback, because there's blind spots. We all have them. But once Hal found that out, he changed his communication. People went, oh, I get it now. Does that help? Okay. So you're saying to yourself maybe, well, that's all fantastic, Alan, but I live in the world in university and things are smaller and I don't have as much influence as maybe you've had in some of your roles. So I'm going to use an example. When I first got out of the Navy, went to work at Procter Gamble at their global upstream lab, Miami Valley Labs. I was really excited until I found out we were ranked 53 out of 53 in North America. If you know anything about Procter & Gamble, they love to measure everything. Now, this is in 2000. They would measure campaigns, meaning when they reached out to customers directly about, what do you like about Tide and what flavor of Tide do you want? That's called primary marketing data. And they have secondary marketing data. You get the idea, right? All 21 metrics that we use, so for the IT folks in the room, things like call time, call volume, we were all in the red. All in the red. It sucked. The hiring manager didn't tell me this. And then he took another job downtown and left me. As a result, team morale is low. And one of the things you'll learn when you get to work with people is that if you really want them to do well and execute, they got to be pumped. And trying to figure out what they can latch into and feel good about the work is key. And that's why the results matter. Because I could go to something hard and they'd be like, oh, all right, I dig it, right? So one of the things that we did is we figured out customer sat. There were several elements to this. One, all the people I worked with, I found out had a common thread. They wanted to make our clients, the 200 researchers at the lab, happy. They just didn't know how to do it. Pragmatically, our bonuses were tied to this, and they had not received their bonus for any member of the team. And it could be significant. So in terms of establishing a tempo, what I did was kind of a hybrid between the two previous examples. We had daily meetings just to talk about things, and I would carve out a portion of that day to talk about how our customer sat was doing, because it was managed by the hour at Procter & Gamble, so we could see it, and I could share it with the team. And then we could consider why that was and maybe improve on it. And then at the end of the week, we would sit down and, today the Agilists will call this a retrospective. I didn't have that term in 2000. I wasn't familiar with it. But we would sit down and just talk about, okay, based on everything we've discussed the last 4 days, what do you think we could do differently? And we started to engage our customers like detergents. So again, they did this esoteric, one of the projects I worked on was how to define softness in cotton. So when Tide goes on an ad and says, we have these 7 things, they've actually done a lot of hard research to validate that. And we, at the time, it was very revolutionary within Procter, was we developed a customer advisory board to ask them what's important to you. One of the things we found out, they didn't like it when it took 2 to 3 days to get a new workstation. Because we got this high-power researcher, and they're not doing research while their laptop's down. And IT tied my hands because they said, you can't buy extra stock. Because one way to solve that problem is to carry some extra gear somewhere. Project managers, we call it a contingency fund, pad the schedule, whatever, right? But they wouldn't let us do that. So I found a solution working with the customers that they would pay for the extra laptops. And then we developed a process where we would share information in a roadmap. And I would revisit the roadmap. And I was shameless in saying, hey, remember how we said we were going to do this for you? And we did it. And I would remind them, right? Which absolutely helped us in terms of, we moved up to 3 out of 53 in 9 months, which infuriated my colleagues, by the way. We were all required to go downtown once a month and share results with the VP IT, and they're like, how's Miami Valley moving up? All the other metrics are red. But the terminal metric was customer sat, was one of the reasons why we selected it, or I selected it for the team, right? And it gave us money. And then, but I wasn't satisfied with that. That was the most important thing. I would then go back and work on the intermediate metrics, 1 or 2 at a time, and fix them. So that by the end of the year, we actually had all 21 metrics, if you include customer sat, under control. But it was a little bit at a time. Before the team, I would argue, was just too swamped. They were just doing too many different things. We improved customer satisfaction, and we went from a 2.0, right, to 4.9. That was pretty good in 9 months. And as I mentioned, they worked with me. They funded outside of my group the workstations that they needed, and so we would replace them within an hour, compared to 2 to 3 days. And more importantly, personally to me, the team was really excited. In fact, when I was coming out here, I posted a note. My network ops manager at the time, she actually posted, "It's fantastic you're going to Wisconsin." We remember each other's contribution from 20 years ago, which is really cool. Oh. All right, so based on that Miami Valley Labs example, what observations, questions do you have?
So we have one in the chat from Robert Merrill, and this is kind of a question over all 3 examples. Do you feel like you're solving the same problem over and over? Why is that problem so stubborn?
That's a great question. So one of the fun challenges to working with people is that we're all different, and it's also maddening as a result. So I didn't consider the problems to be the same all the time, but I could find common threads that I could latch into. And I would suggest to you, there's actually a lady that's written a very nice book about data architecture, information architecture, and I forget her name, but she talks about what are the causes of problems. So the first is, do we all share the same information and therefore have the same perspective on the problem? That's why reframing the problem can be powerful if we can do it. Often I find with stakeholders that we feel are stubborn, they see the world differently. They're using different data. It might be quantitative data, qualitative data that you're using, and especially coming from IT, that's maddening to us. I was at the bank. It sucks, Alan. Your product sucks. Well, I can't act on that. I can't go back to my product partners and ask them to put in a new user story around it sucks, because nothing will get built that will help you. What specifically, and then teasing out the next level, right? So I find it exciting because I see and I learn so much more from each new experience personally. Did that answer the question for me? Okay. How about in here, in the room?
So I think you've given us like that great framework grip to solve these complex problems. But what seemed to me to be a repetitive thing is that you had this ability to reach and talk to and meet the right people to give you insight on how to fix those problems. Do you mind talking a little bit about kind of maybe your mental model or maybe a framework to meet the right people at the right time?
Yeah, that's a great question. Meeting the right people at the right time. One, I've been very fortunate. It has not always been the case. For example, I was in Europe on a work trip, and I said something very insulting like, all you Eastern Europeans. And then I started getting lectured about, well, no, I'm from Poland, I'm from Armenia, I'm from blah, blah, blah. That was day one. So it was a rough start for me. And then it improved as I demonstrated that I was genuinely interested in their success. And it took time. So I think listening really well, which is actually not one of my strengths. I've worked to improve it over the years. And really in being engaged was what one of my GMs taught me, is being engaged in a moment. So multitasking is not a thing for what I do. It's really sitting down with each individual, each client, and really trying to tease out and asking, why is that? And being genuinely curious about their domain and their concern. And that's really helped me with clients because I find most of the time they just want to be heard. And you'll hear about tools like mirroring, like, hey, I heard that you said this. Did you say that? Yeah, okay. But if you can go even deeper and understand their intent and why they're wanting to go that way, it demonstrates to that other party that, all right, you're really understanding me in a way that makes sense, and I can work with this, right? And trying to find that degree of freedom. And then literally every night I would go back to the hotel and I would just pour out all my notes as much as I could remember. Traditionally, when I go in front of clients, I actually bring 2 other people with me, and we would actually sketch out what we were going to say. And the other 2 people take notes, and then we compile our notes in the evening, and then we try to do what you were just doing, like, hey, what did you observe were the common elements in the discussions? Do we see any consistent trends? And something interesting I always like to ask is, what are the things they're not saying? Why is that? Because a lot of times the silence is actually really, really interesting and compelling. Does that help? Yeah. Great question, by the way. Three minutes left? Okay. Well, again, in summary, oh, wait. So thank you so much for your time and your attention this afternoon. I introduced you to a framework I developed with Sarah Koyman and myself around GRIP. So making sure people are aligned to goals, that you've established a rhythm in your activities, that you're intentional in your communication, and finally, that you're going through a process and commit to the process and follow through with it. The consistency will pay off. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.